Owning your first Land Rover is a range of emotions from happiness to hopelessness.
It's hopeless.
To frustration to excitement, back to hopelessness. These vehicles certainly are not for really anyone who has any sort of emotional attachment to money because they rack up the bills very quickly. But if you can detach from all of that, owning a used Land Rover is one of the most fun experiences you can have with any used SUV. We've put together a list of some of the most important tips you can follow when looking for your first Land Rover, but if you're more interested in buying an L322 Range Rover for your first one, we have an entire playlist catered towards that. So be sure to check that out, but for now, let's talk about some of the most important tips you can follow when buying your first Land Rover. Land Rovers have always been one of my biggest passions, and I remember ordering marketing material for different models throughout the years when I was a kid, just so I could look at them over and over again. But there's nobody out there saying that Land Rover ownership is easy and trouble-free. While it's unlikely your Land Rover will explode, it's always good to operate under the assumption that it could, at any given moment, spontaneously combust. Nobody who has owned a Land Rover for really any period of time is going to tell you that it's completely trouble-free and maintenance-free, because it's not. If you're coming from something much more common like a Tahoe or a Honda Accord, you need to be ready for normal things to become a lot more expensive, and everything from gas to oil changes are going to go up in price dramatically. And I understand most people realize that when they're buying their first Land Rover, but it is something that you really do need to be aware of because it is everything going up in price. For example, a trip to the grocery store used to cost me whatever I paid at the grocery store, but now the most expensive part of my trip is getting the Range Rover there and back. And I live a mile away. No matter what model Land Rover you buy, you should be prepared to know the types of basic and scheduled services to do, from more basic oil changes and brakes to less common fluids like gearbox and differential. There are quite a few mechanical parts that most normal SUVs don't normally have to deal with. When you buy your first Land Rover and you end up buying one that hasn't been taken care of the way it should have, you'll end up paying for it multiple times over. So when you do buy your first one, make sure that you have full service records to show what work has been done and what work still needs to be done. Frequent maintenance and service is really the best form of Land Rover ownership because while it may seem expensive on the front end, it is going to be much cheaper in the long run to keep your car serviced and maintained the correct way. Because of that, make sure that you have a list of all of the scheduled maintenance that your car requires, and you'll really be good to go after that. Now let's talk about something that could save you a Rover load of money and time. Models to avoid buying. There are probably a few Land Rover models that, as much as I love the brand and their heritage and everything they've done in the past few years, probably wouldn't be the best entry Land Rover. Believe it or not, the brand is known to have some issues occasionally that can cause some problems.
Are you serious?
Because of that, there are a few models that you might want to stay away from. On the opposite side though, if you're looking for something to be tough on, to work with, and to learn about working on cars, these models may actually be the ones you want to go with. If you're looking for something that you can drive every day and put a lot more miles on, you may want to stay away from these models, but everyone's ownership experience is different. This is just my recommendation. Number one is the P38A, and while the P38 is still one of my favorite Range Rover models ever built, in fact I don't think I have a least favorite one, it is notorious for being one of the most unreliable Range Rovers ever built, which is a big award to get considering every single one of them is pretty unreliable. The 1994 to 2001 P38 Range Rover was a huge step forward from the Range Rover Classic, but with that, it was the first model where Land Rover really started to get a little too techie for their own good, which has continued to happen every model since. Because of that, the P38 Range Rover had issues with everything from engine oil leaks to air suspension to pretty much anything else inside of the Range Rover and outside. And the sunroof likes to leak, and the windows like to leak, and really, if you're looking for something that you don't know how to work on yourself but can get serviced, a P38 Range Rover may be the one to stay away from if it's not been taken care of by the previous owner. Which overall here is one of the biggest tips. If you find a car that's not been taken care of by the previous owner, stay away from that model. Every Land Rover model suffers from something amazing called depreciation, which I've talked about in so many videos, but essentially that makes it cheap for other people who have just a little bit of cash to buy a really cool car. Unfortunately, a lot of these people don't realize what they're actually getting into when they buy an old used Range Rover, and it causes the car to not get the service and care that it really requires. There isn't really suggested service with a Range Rover or any Land Rover in general. It's more of service you need to do right now or it's going to break. That makes it a good time to talk about the next model that I think you should avoid, the Discovery 2. And before you come out of the woodwork, hear me out. There's a reason I'm recommending not buying the Discovery 2. Before I get jumped, I want to say this. If you're buying a Land Rover Discovery 2 and you know what you're doing, you know how to work on them, and you know everything about them, they probably aren't that bad of a car. But if you're buying a Land Rover Discovery 2 and you really have no clue what you're doing as far as mechanical stuff goes, and you're not willing to learn, you need to stay far, far away from the Discovery 2. I will say this though, I would have a D2 if I was looking for any 90s model Land Rover. I think they are still some of the most capable, best looking, and most enthusiastic cars I've ever experienced, and I loved the driving style that the D2 offered. But for your first Land Rover, if you want something that's extremely dependable and won't cause you too many problems, which is an oxymoron in itself, it's probably not the best choice. I would absolutely love to have a Discovery 2 to have something to take off-road, be rough with, and work on myself, but it's not something that I would want to replace this. Overall, it's an extremely capable SUV, but far from the best first choice for your entry-level Land Rover. From blown head gaskets to marking their territory with oil everywhere they go, it's really going to be a little more inconvenient than you would want your daily driver to be. Because of that, a lot of owners get fed up with repairs if they're not ready to undertake the challenge that is Land Rover ownership, and a lot of them get neglected over time. With that, a lot of the things that should have been done will not have been done, and you'll end up having to pay for the vehicle multiple times over with multiple repairs to likely the same parts. I think it's important to point out that the Discovery 2 and the P38A are two of the most iconic Land Rovers ever built, and they are still some of the most capable machines if you're looking to work on something yourself or build the ultimate off-road rig. But like I said, if you don't know how to work on it yourself, these two models are really the ones that you might want to avoid. They are great workhorses and great weekend job cars, but at the same time they can quickly become their own weekend job. Quickly. So as much as I do love them, I find them hard to recommend to someone who's looking to buy their first one and have as little trouble as possible. I don't think anyone's gonna deny that. So with my two personal favorite vehicles Land Rover have ever built out of the running, here are some models that might actually make more sense to buy if you're looking for your first Land Rover and don't want to put too much work in it yourself. Number one on the list is the L322 Range Rover, and I know I'm taking a bit of a risk here recommending this thing when I've made so many videos about problems I've had in the past, and on top of that there's also the infamous Doug DeMuro Range Rover. But it is still one of the best models ever built, and because of that, parts are still readily available and it's modern enough to where you can live with it every single day. On top of that, the ride is excellent and everything about the car still works pretty well, just as long as it's fixed over and over again. But for a more technical reason as to why I think the L322 is one of the better models, it comes down to something actually really simple. Land Rover switched ownership a few times during the production of the L322, which gave them access to more parts and, more importantly, more money. This meant that they were able to put different parts and different things in the car that made it just a slight bit more reliable. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to call any Land Rover reliable, but because of the access to all of these parts, the L322 was just a little bit more reliable than previous models. A little bit. A very little chunk. Just a little. You'll still need to prepare for some service trips as well as scheduled maintenance and unscheduled maintenance, but at the end of the day, the L322 Range Rover is one of the best models that you can buy. Just don't forget that it is still, at the end of the day, a Land Rover, so you are still going to need to do some unscheduled maintenance, but you're going to be a little bit better off than you would in a 90s model. I have plenty of videos on the L322 Range Rover, so if you're interested, go ahead and check those out in this playlist up in the eye. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about the next model, the Discovery 3, or LR3. Wherever you are in the world, the third generation Discovery LR model they made. After the Discovery 2, we saw a completely new lineup of Land Rover called the Discovery 3, or in the US, the LR3.
Ladies and gentlemen, the all-new Land Rover LR3.
Now the LR3 was a huge dramatic change from the Discovery 2, even from the outside design to the interior quality. The Discovery 3 or LR3 was light years ahead of the previous generation Discovery 2. Surprisingly, the LR3 has held up very well over the years. Aside from the usual air suspension and random electronic glitches and leaks, you'll run into a lot of cracking plastics. If you can look past that or replace it yourself, you'll be in good shape. We're starting to see a lot of LR3s come up with nearly 200,000 miles on them, which is nothing new to used Land Rovers, but still pretty impressive considering the reputation the LR3 has for being a very complex and almost over-designed machine. Because of that, you would expect a lot of times that the LR3 wouldn't nearly make it to 200,000 miles, but a lot of them are starting to come up for a decent price near that. Even better than that, though, is the fact that a lot of these models are still in really good condition, and many of them have been converted away from the air suspension they were originally built with. Because of that, that means you're going to have much fewer suspension problems, which is good considering that's some of the most expensive part about Land Rover ownership. And sure, some people say that converting it to springs ruins the ride quality, but at the end of the day, it's a rugged off-road Land Rover, not a Rolls-Royce Phantom. So it doesn't really matter that much. In fact, I promise if you ride in an LR3 with air suspension and an LR3 with springs, over time you won't really feel the difference whatsoever. On top of that, most of them should have had their major services done if they have over 120,000 miles on them. If they haven't though, you may want to keep looking. For the third recommendation, let's talk about a very peculiar Land Rover, the LR2. Now the Freelander was originally released in 1997, fit for people with active lifestyles. Now, I don't really know what an active lifestyle means, so this car wasn't marketed to me whatsoever. Then later in its life, the Freelander was replaced with the LR2, and I don't know how that happened, but again, Land Rover have always had a bit of a problem with naming vehicles. So we had the Freelander, and then we had the Freelander 2, but in the US we had the LR2.
That doesn't make sense.
The LR2 makes its way onto the list because of its simplicity. Unlike the big full-fat Range Rover and the LR3, the LR2 has a little bit more simplicity to it. There are fewer, still some, but fewer mechanical bits to go wrong, and there are fewer electronic bits to go wrong. On top of that, the engines are much smaller and easier to work on, and overall it's a very pleasant experience, because it is just as capable as almost any other Land Rover. Thanks to hill descent control and traction control and terrain response, the LR2 is really one of the best Land Rovers you can buy. It also has just as much space on the interior as the full-size Land Rover and Range Rover, which is surprising considering it looks so much smaller. And sure, you may have a little bit less room up front, but overall you have just as much practicality as you do in these. In fact, you even have some more practicality because of the seating. On top of that, the LR2 is much more economical and much easier to drive around cities than its big brother, the L322 and the Discovery 3. Trust me. With that though, it really doesn't have the compromises of a small SUV that you would really think it would have. In fact, it is extremely capable and it's extremely spacious inside, even though it looks much smaller from the outside. There's plenty of storage space in the LR2 and it's plenty capable off-road that you'll really never notice a difference unless you're climbing some of the most extreme conditions. Overall though, the LR2 is not perfect, but it's about near as perfect of a Land Rover as you can get if you're looking for just a consumer car to drive around in most of the time that can also go up a mountain. Because of that, it's a great entry point into the Land Rover cult that you will inevitably join. And if you do, be sure to use my discount code so I get 10% off parts and labor. Thank you. The next tip is a bit unconventional, and it's probably not one you'd get most places, but hear me out for a minute. Land Rover owners are full of passion for these vehicles and the Land Rover brand in general. With that, you'll have access to more resources to help you figure out small problems. Don't get me wrong though, if you have a problem with your Land Rover or there's something broken, definitely get it fixed by someone who knows what they're doing, but these Facebook groups and forums give you easy access to people who have dealt with the same issues and can tell you how you can fix it yourself for a little bit cheaper and how you can bond with your car a little bit, which is apparently very important to some people, as I've been told in many comments. Work on it yourself, you bond with the car. Like, I don't really need to bond with the car any more than I have. In fact, it's a little weird how much I've bonded with it already. It's also a great place to meet other Land Rover fanatics and to be able to take your Land Rovers and do active lifestyle things. Whatever that means. But just don't tell them I told you not to buy a D2 or P38 because I'll be banned. Overall though, owning a Land Rover is certainly an experience, and it's also a range of emotions. Many puns intended. It's irrational and really there's no reason you would do that to yourself, but after a while, you really start to love the brand and love the vehicle. After a while though, you just get hooked. For my last trick of the night, I'll tell you about one of the most important things you can do when buying any used vehicle, whether it's a Honda Cross Tour or a used Land Rover. And it's really one that I talk about in every single buyer's guide, but hear me out, I'll make it quick. Get a pre-purchase inspection. That is the single most important thing you can do if you don't know how to work on these cars yourselves, or if you're not competent enough in your mechanical skills to be able to fix the big problems that go wrong. These cars have a lot of scheduled service, and if they've not been done correctly, that can cause a lot of problems in the future. So to keep it short, simple, and sweet, if you're buying a used Land Rover, make sure you take it to someone who knows how to work on them and can do a pre-purchase buyer's inspection for you. That's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money fixing things that you could have known from the start, so just be sure to do that before you buy any used vehicle. Nevertheless, guys, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed, leave a thumbs up. Be sure to check out Downforce so I can do some more repairs to my Land Rover, and I will see you guys in the next video. Be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell to get notified every time we upload a new video, but I will see you next time. I don't know why I acted like I was about to throw the camera off the tripod, but apparently I was.